At Windsor Castle, at 2:14 a.m., while a biting winter darkness swallowed the ancient corridors where the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of brass clocks, an emergency signal shattered the absolute silence. You are not just watching a routine report on royal security. You are witnessing the precise moment a centuries-old system reached its breaking point. Prince William's private phone rang with a distinctive tone, the kind of vibration reserved only for a crisis that divides time into before and after. On the other end was Sir Clive Alderton, the King's principal private secretary, a man whose composure is legendary even during the monarchy's darkest hours. But tonight, his voice carried a weight William had never heard before, an irreversible urgency. A private jet had just touched down on a secondary runway at Heathrow without any prior clearance, carrying a secret that could permanently drop the palace's mask. The passenger was Prince Harry. However, the crisis wasn't merely his sudden appearance. It was what he brought with him, and the ease with which he bypassed the surveillance network. The palace machine worked so tirelessly to control. As William stood alone in his office, the cold streetlights casting long, clinical shadows across the floor, he realized the silence the family had carefully managed for months had officially become a ticking time bomb. William moved with the focused urgency of a man trained for a role he prayed would never arrive so soon. He found Catherine, and with one look at his face, she understood that something catastrophic was unfolding. A chill that had nothing to do with the December weather outside. There were no questions, only the heavy realization that the everything is fine narrative was crumbling in real time. Inside King Charles's private study, the truth was unspooling through encrypted reports. The king didn't just see a rebellious son. He saw the deep, structural cracks in a monarchy that no amount of polished PR could hide anymore. Harry's long silence hadn't been an act of submission. It was a preparation for an act that threatened to dismantle the final shields of royal privacy and institutional security. Before dawn, a series of locked-down communication protocols were activated. The palace machinery roared to life with terrifying precision, preparing for a decision that would redefine the Sussex's future: the immediate stripping of Harry's remaining royal protection. This was not a personal act of spite. It was an institutional immune response, the system protecting its own survival when a part of itself threatened the stability of the whole. A sense of ominous dread settled over every corner of the castle. Senior staff would later describe the air as being thick with the tension of an ancient institution, realizing it can bleed. In that haunting silence, one truth became undeniable. The rules of the game had changed, and the fairy tale monarchy was being forced to face its own mortality. The drive from Kensington to Windsor usually takes 40 minutes, but tonight, William's security detail carved through the Berkshire fog in less than 20. Inside the car, the silence was absolute, heavy with the weight of a constitutional crisis that had moved from a theoretical threat to a physical reality. As the car swept through the Sovereign's gate, William saw the lights burning in the king's private library, a signal that the man who had waited 70 years for the crown was now facing the most agonizing decision of his short reign. When William stepped into the room, he didn't see the King of the United Kingdom. He saw a father who looked physically diminished, his hands trembling slightly as he held a set of flight manifests. The late-night flight discovery wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a breach of a sacred, unspoken contract. Harry's unannounced arrival, bypassing the usual diplomatic channels, had forced the institution's hand. You must understand the stakes here. In the world of high-stakes monarchy, silence is a shield. But once that shield is used as a weapon against the center must strike back to survive. "He's here, William," Charles said, his voice sounding thin and worn, like parchment. "And he didn't come alone." The king gestured to a folder on his mahogany desk, a dossier compiled by the security services in the hours since the jet touched down. It revealed that the Sussexes were no longer just private citizens living abroad. They had become a parallel court, one that operated outside the palace's control, but still demanded the palace's protection. William stood by the fireplace, the cold ash reflecting the state of their fraternal bond. He knew what had to be done. even if his father was still clinging to the hope of a quiet resolution. "We cannot protect a shadow court that refuses to follow the rules of the crown," William said, his tone clinical, devoid of the emotion that usually clouded family disputes. This was the voice of the future king, the man who understood that the survival of the firm depends on the clarity of its boundaries. The late-night discovery had unearthed more than just a flight path. It revealed a series of private communications and security bypasses that made the current Sussex protection arrangement not only expensive, but dangerous. The palace machine, that invisible network of advisors and legal experts, had already reached a consensus. The protection, the ultimate symbol of royal belonging, had to be stripped. It was the only way to signal to the world, and to Harry himself, that you cannot be half in and half out when it comes to the safety of the sovereign. For nearly an hour, father and son sat in that dimly lit room, debating the fallout. Charles, the emotional core of the family, searched for a way to show mercy. William, the strategic brain of the institution, looked for a way to ensure stability. They were no longer just family members. They were the two pillars of a crumbling establishment trying to reinforce the foundations before the storm hit the headlines. As the clocks struck 3 a.m., the decision was finalized. The legal documents, already drafted by the Home Office and the royal household, were moved to the top of the king's red box. The stripping of the Sussex protection was no longer a threat, no, was now a decree. The message was clear. The palace had dropped the mask of family unity to prioritize institutional integrity. In the coming hours, the world would wake up to a monarchy that had finally chosen its side. The late-night discovery was not just about a jet sitting on a darkened runway. It was about the cargo it carried, intellectual and strategic cargo that threatened to blow the doors off the palace's carefully constructed peace. While William and Charles sat in the library, a separate, more clinical operation was unfolding in the windowless rooms of the Home Office and the security services. Intelligence officials from RAVEC, the committee that oversees royal protection, had been monitoring this flight since it left Californian airspace. What they found in the digital wake of that journey was the final nail in the coffin for Prince Harry's Sussex protection. The dossier presented to the king was a chilling testament to how far the parallel court in Montecito had drifted from the center. It wasn't just a list of travel protocols. It was evidence of unsanctioned media coordination and high-level meetings planned on British soil that bypassed the sovereign's authority entirely. The discovery revealed that the taxpayer-funded security Harry was demanding was no longer being used to protect a member of the family. It was being used as the logistical backbone for a rival brand. For the palace machine, this was the ultimate betrayal. The security detail was being treated like a private concierge for a global media entity, not a shield for a prince of the realm. William looked over the intelligence reports, his eyes narrowing as he read through the encrypted communications that had been flagged. The discovery indicated that while Harry was in the air, his team was already pitching exclusive access to the very trip the palace didn't even know was happening. It was a monetization of his royal proximity that made his presence in the UK a liability rather than a homecoming. In the eyes of the institution, you cannot ask the state to pay for your safety while you are actively working to undermine the state's most prestigious institution. This was the late-night discovery that changed the tone of the conversation from concern to consequence. The men in grey, the invisible bureaucrats who keep the wheels of monarchy turning, had long argued that Harry was a security risk because he no longer operated within the circle of trust. Now, they had the physical evidence to prove it. The discovery showed a pattern of behavior where sensitive royal movements were being shared with non-vetted third parties for the sake of content. For William, who has built his life around the sanctity of the inner circle, this was an unforgivable breach of the blood bond. Charles sat back, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever. He realized that by continuing to provide high-level protection to Harry, he was essentially subsidizing a campaign against his own reign. The late-night discovery had laid bare the hypocrisy of the Sussex position, demanding the status of a senior royal while practicing the commercialism of a celebrity. The king's senior physician and constitutional advisors stood by the windows, their faces etched with the somber realization that the family mask had finally slipped. The institution had to act, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. As the documents were finalized under the dim light of the library, the transition from family member to security liability was complete. The paper trail left no room for interpretation. It was a cold, calculated analysis of a risk that had grown too large to manage. The decision to strip the protection was the only logical step left for a monarchy that was tired of being used as a backdrop for someone else's narrative. The discovery had shifted the power dynamic permanently, and by dawn, the Sussexes would find themselves on the outside of a door that had been locked from the inside. As the first gray streaks of a freezing December dawn began to bleed over the horizon of Windsor Great Park, the atmosphere inside the castle shifted from the frantic energy of a crisis to the heavy, stagnant air of a funeral. But this was not a funeral for a person. It was a funeral for a bond. Prince William stood at the tall windows of the state apartments, watching the mist cling to the ancient oaks. He had not slept. In his hand was a cold cup of tea, untouched, mirroring the frozen state of his relationship with the man he once called his closest ally. The late-night flight discovery had acted like a chemical reagent, stripping away the last layers of sentimentality to reveal a harsh, structural truth. The Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex were no longer speaking the same language. You have to imagine the psychological weight of this moment. For decades, the spare was a safety net, a supporting pillar for the future king. But as the sun rose, William realized that the spare had become a phantom, a ghost haunting the corridors of the monarchy rather than helping to sustain them. The discovery of Harry's unsanctioned arrival and his parallel agenda had forced William to undergo a brutal internal transformation. He was no longer a brother grieving a lost relationship. He was the heir to the throne, assessing a threat to the state. The warmth of their shared childhood, the secrets whispered behind palace walls, and the trauma of losing their mother, all of it seemed to dissolve in the clinical light of the morning. Catherine joined him in the silence, her presence a quiet anchor in the swirling chaos. She didn't need to ask what had been decided in the library. She could see it in the set of William's shoulders, a posture that had aged 20 years in a single night. The decision to strip the Sussex protection was the final, formal acknowledgement that Harry was now an outsider. In the world of the British monarchy, protection is the ultimate currency of trust. To lose it is to be excommunicated from the inner circle. As William looked out over the sprawling estate, he wasn't just thinking about security guards or police escorts. He was thinking about the total collapse of a 1,000-year-old family tradition of loyalty. The late-night discovery had laid bare a painful reality. Harry's presence in the UK was no longer a homecoming. It was an intervention. The discovery that Harry's team was actively coordinating media narratives while the king sat in a state of health-related vulnerability was the point of no return. For William, this was the ultimate betrayal of the firm's code of silence. He realized that every time he looked at his brother, he was now looking at a camera lens, a recording device, or a potential chapter in a future memoir. The brother he knew was gone, replaced by a global brand that thrived on the very friction it caused the monarchy. King Charles appeared in the doorway, the early morning light unforgiving on his tired features. The two men, father and son, exchanged a look that contained the weight of 1,000 years of history. There was no room for rage anymore, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The spare narrative had officially been dismantled. The system had determined that the risk of inclusion was now far greater than the pain of exclusion. By stripping the protection, they were not just removing bodyguards, they were removing the shadow that Harry had cast over the throne for far too long. As the world outside Windsor began to wake up, unaware that the foundations of the royal family had been permanently altered during the night, William turned away from the window. The decision was final. The paperwork was signed. The ghost of the spare had been exorcised by the cold requirements of duty. In that moment, William didn't feel like a victor in a power struggle. He felt like a man who had finally accepted that he would have to walk the path to the throne alone. The bond was severed, not by a single act of anger, but by the slow, inevitable realization that blood is not always thicker than the crown. By 8 a.m., the internal tragedy of the House of Windsor had officially crossed the threshold from a family dispute into a clinical operation of the British state. In the world of the monarchy, the family may grieve, but the machine, that vast, invisible network of private secretaries, Home Office officials, and security chiefs, does not pause for sentiment. As the clocks across London struck the hour, the late-night flight discovery was no longer a secret whispered in the King's library. It had become the catalyst for a systematic dismantling of Prince Harry's status. The men in grey, those nameless architects of royal survival, had taken the decision made by Charles and William and transformed it into a series of irreversible legal and logistical directives. You must understand the cold mechanics of what it means to strip Sussex protection. It is not merely about removing bodyguards. It is about the formal revocation of state-sponsored legitimacy. In a secure room within the Home Office, members of RAVEC, the Executive Committee for the Protection of Royalty and Public Figures, convened via an encrypted line. The intelligence gathered from the midnight landing had provided the machine with the evidence it needed to argue that Harry had fundamentally breached the Sandringham Agreement. By arriving unannounced and conducting unsanctioned business on UK soil, he had moved himself outside the category of a protected person. The Palace Press Office, meanwhile, began preparing the grey-out strategy, a method of communication where the truth is not denied, but the oxygen of publicity is systematically withdrawn. The late-night discovery had revealed a catastrophic failure of trust that the palace machine could no longer ignore. For years, the institution had attempted to maintain a bridge between the king and his second son, but the discovery of a parallel media agenda during a time of royal vulnerability was viewed as an act of institutional sabotage. The directives issued at 8 a.m. were precise. All high-level intelligence sharing with the Sussex team was to cease immediately. The diplomatic protection usually afforded to visiting royals was to be downgraded to that of a private citizen of high interest. To the public, it might look like a family spat, but behind the scenes, it was a surgical strike designed to isolate the spare from the machinery of the crown. William's private secretary and the king's advisors worked in tandem to ensure there were no loopholes. The discovery had shown that the Sussexes were using their royal security as a badge of authority to gain access to spaces they were no longer entitled to inhabit. By stripping this protection, the palace was effectively deplatforming Harry from his role as a global representative of the monarchy. The atmosphere in the offices was one of grim satisfaction for some and profound sadness for others. But for the machine, it was simply a matter of maintaining the structural integrity of the throne. The system had identified a virus, a source of instability, and the 8 a.m. execution of these orders was the immune response in action. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the cold stone of Whitehall, the formal letters were dispatched. These were not emotional pleas. They were cold, legal notifications that the Sussexes' security status had been permanently altered. The late-night flight discovery had forced the palace to drop the pretense of working toward a reconciliation. In the clinical eyes of the bureaucracy, you are either within the circle of duty, or you are a liability to be managed. There is no middle ground. The decision to strip the protection was the final closing of the gate. The machine had spoken, and for Prince Harry, the realization was about to hit. In the battle between blood and the state always wins. By 9:30 a.m., the cold legal reality of the morning had met the feverish heat of the global news cycle. In the world of the British monarchy, the most powerful weapon in the arsenal is not speech, but strategic silence. As the first grainy images of a private jet at Heathrow began to circulate on social media, the Palace Press Office initiated the public mask protocol. This is the art of the no comment, a silence so heavy and so deliberate that it dictates the narrative more effectively than any press release ever could. While the Sussex team in California scrambled to frame the trip as a private visit of concern, the palace machine began the subtle process of grey-out communication. You must look closely at how the palace manages the optics of a crisis. They do not fight the story. They starve it of oxygen. To the world watching on television, the king appeared to be continuing his recovery at Windsor, and Prince William was seen attending a scheduled briefing on environmental initiatives. The mask of business as usual was absolute. Yet, beneath this veneer of tranquility, the communications team was leaking specific, clinical details to trusted royal correspondents. The goal was simple: to frame the stripping of Harry's protection not as an act of familial aggression, but as a necessary, boring, and inevitable administrative adjustment. By the time the news of the late-night discovery hit the front pages, the public had been conditioned to see Harry's arrival as a breach of protocol, rather than a homecoming. The psychology behind this public mask is fascinating. The palace knows that for the older, loyalist audience, the heart of the monarchy's support reliability is everything. By staying silent while Harry's team released frantic statements, the palace made itself look like the adult in the room. They portrayed the crown as a steady, unshakable institution, and the Sussexes as a chaotic, unpredictable force. The late-night flight discovery was presented to the media as a security headache rather than a family tragedy. This shift in language is crucial. It depersonalizes the conflict. It moves the conversation from the emotional bond of two brothers to the cold requirements of state security and taxpayer value. Inside the press office, monitors flickered with live feeds from CNN, BBC, and Sky News. Every word was scrutinized. The palace advisors knew that the late-night discovery had given them the ultimate leverage. They didn't need to attack Harry. They simply had to let the facts of his unsanctioned arrival speak for themselves. The discovery that Harry had bypassed the circle of trust was the narrative anchor. It justified every hardline decision made in the library just hours earlier. By noon, the narrative in the UK was shifting. The question was no longer, why is the king being so harsh? But why did Harry think he could land secretly and still demand the state's protection? As the global media ripples turned into a tidal wave, William and Catherine remained behind the walls of Kensington Palace, maintaining the dignified distance that has become their hallmark. They understood that the public mask is the only thing that keeps the institution from dissolving into a tabloid soap opera. By stripping the protection in private and letting the news leak out as an administrative reality, they had effectively boxed the Sussexes into a corner. Harry was left to explain his actions to a skeptical public, while the Crown simply continued its work. The machine had successfully transformed a potentially explosive family confrontation into a controlled, clinical demonstration of institutional power. The moment of realization for Prince Harry did not come with a grand confrontation or a televised debate. It came with a sudden, deafening silence. As the clock moved past 10 a.m. at his temporary residence in the UK, the late-night flight discovery had moved from a tactical maneuver to a strategic disaster. You have to understand Harry's psychological state in this moment. He had arrived on British soil, thinking he was holding the cards, believing that a surprise landing would force a face-to-face meeting with his father. Instead, he woke up to find that the palace machine had not only anticipated his move, but had used it as the legal grounds for his total institutional excommunication. The first sign was the withdrawal of the specialized security detail, the subtle but unmistakable shifting of the men in suits who had accompanied him from the airport. The Sussex reaction was a mixture of profound shock and a frantic attempt to regain control of a narrative that was slipping through his fingers. For Harry, the stripping of his protection was more than a logistical hurdle. It was the ultimate symbolic rejection. In the language of the British monarchy, protection is the physical manifestation of belonging. To have it stripped away while on UK soil was a clear clinical message from Charles and William. You are a visitor, not a member. The discovery of his unsanctioned flight had provided the Crown with the smoking gun needed to prove that Harry was no longer playing by the rules of the institution. As he realized the extent of the lockout, the Spare was forced to confront the reality that his status as a royal-born prince no longer guaranteed him a seat at the table of state. Inside the Sussex camp, the air was thick with a panicked coordination of media responses. But every statement they drafted felt inadequate against the wall of strategic silence coming from Windsor. This is the Tuhuyat Kamzuk, emotional death point, for the Sussex brand. They thrive on conflict and engagement, but they are powerless against cold, bureaucratic indifference. Harry's late-night discovery was intended to be a show of strength, a demonstration that he could still move through the corridors of power at will. Instead, it became the evidence used to justify his containment. The realization that his own father and brother had authorized this move, not out of anger, but out of a calculated need for stability, was a psychological blow that hit harder than any tabloid headline. The discovery had unmasked the fundamental mismatch between Harry's perception and the palace's reality. Harry saw himself as a concerned son trying to break through a wall of advisors. The palace saw him as a commercial entity attempting to breach a secure perimeter. By 11 a.m., as the news of the stripped protection began to solidify in the legal sphere, the Sussex team realized they were no longer fighting for a half-in, half-out arrangement. They were fighting for relevance in a country that had officially downgraded their importance. The reaction was visceral, a feeling of being hunted without a shield, of being exposed to the very public scrutiny they had spent years trying to control. As Harry stood in a high-walled garden, far from the security of Windsor or the warmth of Kensington, the weight of the late-night discovery finally settled. He was in the country of his birth, yet he had never been more of a stranger. The decision to strip the protection was the final, formal end to the spare era. The crown had moved on, and it had done so with a clinical efficiency that left no room for negotiation. In the silence of that morning, the realization was absolute. The protection was gone, the trust was shattered, and the flight that was supposed to be a bridge had instead become the fire that burned it down. As the afternoon light faded over the towers of Westminster, the crisis shifted from the emotional halls of Windsor to the sterile, high-stakes boardrooms of the Treasury and the Home Office. The late-night flight discovery had done more than just burn a bridge. It had triggered a massive financial and legal reclassification that would haunt the Sussexes for years to come. In the world of global power, protection is not just a safety measure, it is a massive financial asset. By stripping Harry of his automatic state security, the Crown was effectively handing him a bill for millions of dollars a year, a cost that no amount of Netflix deals or book royalties can easily sustain over a lifetime. You must analyze the cold calculus of this decision. The British government, under the guidance of Ravek, has established a legal precedent that is almost impossible to overturn. By documenting Harry's unsanctioned arrival as a private commercial endeavor, the palace machine ensured that the taxpayer would no longer be liable for his safety. This is the Tour Huat-Tai-Chin, financial death point for the Sussex brand. For a prince who has spent his entire life behind a wall of state-funded steel, the transition to the private security market is a brutal wake-up call. Private security firms, no matter how expensive, lack the intelligence-sharing capabilities, diplomatic immunity, and international jurisdiction that come with the Crown's protection. Harry is not just losing bodyguards, he is losing the sovereign shield that allowed him to move through the world as a protected entity. The legal fallout extends far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. The late-night discovery has sent a clear signal to foreign governments from the United States to Canada and beyond. If the UK government no longer classifies Prince Harry as a high-profile protected person, other nations are no longer obligated to provide the high-level diplomatic security and motorcades that have defined his international travel. The discovery that Harry had bypassed the formal diplomatic channels during his latest flight was the justification needed to downgrade his status on the global stage. He is now, in the eyes of international law, a private citizen of high interest, but one without the official backing of his head of state. This legal excommunication makes every public appearance a massive logistical and financial burden for the Sussexes. Inside the palace, the accountants and legal advisors have been meticulous. They are not just cutting costs, they are cutting ties. The discovery of Harry's parallel court has led to a review of every remaining financial link between the Sussexes and the royal estate. The message from Charles and William is unmistakable. If you want to operate as an independent entity, you must be prepared to pay for it entirely. This includes the hidden costs of international travel, the legal fees for navigating foreign jurisdictions, and the massive insurance premiums required to protect a family of their profile without state backing. The machine is forcing Harry into a pay-to-play reality that threatens to drain the very wealth he has worked so hard to accumulate since leaving the family. As the legal documents were filed and the financial directives issued, the Sussexes found themselves in a unique kind of exile. They are still globally famous, but they are now institutionally isolated. The late-night flight discovery was the catalyst that allowed the crown to finally balance the books. The protection was the last great tether between the spare and the throne. By cutting it, the palace has officially closed the Sussex account. The financial and legal fallout is not a temporary hurdle. It is a permanent restructuring of their lives. Harry and Meghan are no longer protected by the shadow of the crown. They are now standing in the harsh, expensive light of the real world, where the cost of a mistake is no longer covered by the sovereign. The late-night flight discovery was never just about a security breach. It was the definitive catalyst for the dawn of the William era. As the legal dust settled in the offices of Whitehall, a new and formidable figure emerged from the shadows of the old guard, the enforcer. For years, the global public has viewed Prince William through the lens of the grieving son, the devoted husband, or the modernizing prince. But the events of the last 24 hours have stripped away those softer layers to reveal the cold, structural steel beneath. William is no longer just the heir-in-waiting. He has officially become the primary guardian of the monarchy's survival. By leading the charge to strip Harry's protection, William has sent an unmistakable message. Under his watch, the crown is a fortress, and there are no side gates for those who choose to live outside its walls. You must analyze the profound psychological shift that has occurred within the Prince of Wales. This decision was not born from a place of fraternal anger or petty revenge. It was a clinical demonstration of sovereign duty. William has watched the institution struggle with the Sussex fallout for years, observing how half measures and emotional pleas have slowly drained the monarchy of its dignity and authority. The discovery of Harry's secret landing was the moment William decided that the half-in, half-out era was over. He has proven that he is willing to do what his predecessors often hesitated to do, prioritize the health of the state over the survival of his own family bonds. This is the birth of the enforcer reign, where the monarchy moves away from the never complain, never explain mantra and toward a philosophy of swift, irreversible consequences. William's strategy is rooted in a deep, bone-deep commitment to the future, specifically to the reign of Prince George. He is playing a long-term game that spans decades, not just news cycles. He understands that if he allows a parallel, commercialized court to operate with royal protection today, he is essentially leaving a poisoned chalice for his own son to manage. By stripping the protection now, William is sanitizing the line of succession. He is ensuring that when George eventually takes the throne, the boundaries of royal service are absolute and uncontested. The discovery gave William the legal and moral leverage to set a precedent that will define the next century of the House of Windsor. He is signaling to every future member of the family that royal status is a sacred duty of service, not a commercial birthright for celebrity branding. As the sun set over the castle grounds, those close to the prince reported a sense of ruthless clarity in his demeanor. He no longer views the Sussex situation as a family drama to be solved through mediation. He sees it as a systemic vulnerability that has been patched. The stripping of the protection is the first public act of this new, uncompromising authority. It is a warning to anyone who would attempt to monetize their royal proximity. The crown has teeth, and the future king is not afraid to use them. William has stepped out from the shadow of his father's more conciliatory approach and into the light of a new kind of kingship, one that is leaner, more disciplined, and entirely focused on its constitutional purpose. The transformation is complete. The monarchy that William will one day lead will be one of ironclad boundaries and absolute loyalty to the center. The late-night flight discovery was the ultimate stress test, proving that William can compartmentalize his personal grief to meet the requirements of the crown. He has embraced the role of the enforcer, not out of a desire for power, but out of a desperate need to save the institution from itself. As the lights dimmed in the palace, it was clear that the Prince of Wales had finally accepted a painful truth. To preserve the monarchy for the next generation, he he must be prepared to walk the path to the throne without his brother by his side. As the last echoes of the legal directives faded into the stone walls of Windsor, the late-night flight discovery reached its ultimate conclusion: the placement of the final seal. In the long, turbulent history of the House of Windsor, there are moments that define a century, and tonight was one of them. This was not a temporary cooling of relations or a seasonal rift. It was the formal, structural end of the Sussex era within the British monarchy. By stripping the protection and reclassifying Prince Harry as a private global citizen, King Charles and Prince William have effectively closed a chapter that has haunted the throne for nearly half a decade. The mask of family unity has not just slipped, it has been set aside in favor of the uncompromising requirements of constitutional survival. You must reflect on the sheer finality of the final seal. In the world of the monarchy, the greatest power is the ability to make someone unpersoned within the institution. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Harry found himself in a reality where the doors to the inner circle were not just closed, but double-locked. The discovery of his unsanctioned flight was the catalyst that allowed the crown to move from a defensive posture to a definitive one. The protection was the last physical thread connecting the spare to the sovereign. With that thread cut, the Sussexes are now adrift in the commercial world, stripped of the state-sponsored legitimacy that once made them untouchable. This is the Tu Huit Kui Kung, the final death point, the realization that the monarchy has learned to function and even thrive without them. The historical gravity of this moment cannot be overstated. William, as the enforcer of the crown, has successfully managed the most significant internal threat to the monarchy's stability since the abdication of 1936. By using the late-night discovery as a clinical tool for reclassification, he has protected the future reign of his son, Prince George, from the unpredictability of a rival court. The final seal ensures that the monarchy remains a singular, unified force. The institution has proven that it is a living organism capable of amputating a limb to save the heart. While the personal tragedy of a broken family will linger in the tabloids, the state tragedy has been resolved with surgical precision. The crown has chosen its path, and that path does not include the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. As we look at the empty runway at Heathrow where this crisis began, we see the true cost of the spare's gamble. The flight that was intended to be a show of strength ended as a masterclass in institutional containment. The final seal is a reminder to the world that while individual royals may come and go, the crown is eternal, cold, and absolute. The era of the Sussexes as royal players is over. The era of Harry as a private celebrity has begun. The gates of Windsor remain standing, indifferent to the drama, protecting a king who has found peace in clarity and an heir who has found strength in duty. The story of the late-night discovery ends here, not with a bang, but with the quiet, heavy click of a lock that will likely never be turned again. Thank you for bearing witness to this clinical analysis of power, duty, and the cold reality of the British monarchy. The crown remains, but the family is forever altered. From which country are you watching this historical shift unfold? Your perspective adds depth to our understanding of this global institution.